my interest in fair trade goes back, some 30 or more years ago. I remember one of the churches I went to had this thing called fair trade coffee at a time when relatively few people knew about it. But where it was most prominent was in churches. And for a while, I used to teach home economics students doing food degrees. And it was also a pleasure to have a lecture, which I did every year, on fair trade, because many of them are fresh out of school and hadn't got a clue what fair trade was all about. The world has changed, obviously, has moved on a lot, but there are still many people who don't know it. And indeed, there are many churches even who don't use it when they serve coffee. And of course, there are many other products, as we'll hear about from Sarah in a moment. So it's been a long-standing interest of mine, and I'm sure many of you too have had this interest in it. And as with our previous workshops, the purpose of tonight is to refresh our memories about the journey of fair trade over the past decades, but also to hear from Sarah something about where the movement is at the moment. Where's it got to? What's the future? How can we accelerate progress towards a world where all workers are paid fairly? And as Sarah will say, there's more to it than that. Sarah's background is a long experience in working with the underprivileged and poor. She's been at the Fairtrade Foundation for over 11 years, and she currently leads their campaigning work, in particular aiming to engage the public in advocacy around fairer trade. But she's worked in many different areas. She's worked on campaigning for living wages in cocoa, bananas, government support for farmers and workers, and in particular, in more recent years, how the problems have made their lives more difficult through the climate crisis. She has a background at university, having studied post-colonial literature, and she's work on trade justice began with Oxfam back in the early 2000s. She's really interested in particular in the intersectional impact that fair trade can have on communities across the world. And I'm looking forward to learning from what she means by the intersectional impact that fair trade can have. So we're pleased, we're delighted that you can join us today, Farah, and contribute to this workshop. And it's over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was such a nice intro. I'm quite impressed with myself then, but I'm only joking. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I always love coming out and speaking to people, and it was really great, I guess, first off, to hear you talk particularly about the history of churches and fair trade, because, of course, we were, as a foundation, which is where I work, set up by a group of founding organisations, two of which were CAFOD and Christian Aid. So, you know, churches have been very formative in creating the Fairtrade Foundation and enabling the work that we do. And a lot of that was driven by the initial work of churches in bringing over and thinking about different ways to trade in their local churches and their church stalls, and the work they were doing to uplift people that were struggling in the trade system. So it was great to hear you talk about that. I do have a few slides that I'm going to talk through, but they're mainly just to give you something a bit more interesting to look at that's not just me talking. So I will also share them with you afterwards, and I think Kat is going to very kindly share them for me. So whenever you're ready, Kat, you can get those up and we can start going through them. But I'm not going to block read all the text on them. Some of them are a little bit text heavy, but that's more so that you can have that information after I've finished speaking this evening. Well, while you're doing that, Kat, I will just, I'll quickly explain what I mean about the intersectional nature of trade, because I haven't got a specific talking point on it particularly, although you'll hopefully see what I mean as I go through the presentation this evening. But I think one of the reasons that I have campaigned for fair trade, or for fair trade, two words, for such a long time, and particularly for trade justice, is there are so many different issues and concerns to worry about today. And I know I'm joining you this evening in a particularly challenging time in the UK, but everything from racism to human rights to the climate crisis to gender violence, you know, there are just so many different issues, and I think it can sometimes feel very overwhelming as a person to feel that you have to engage in all of them, or have something that you're doing on all of them, or finding some way to make a difference in them. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about trade justice is that I feel that it is a key issue that can deal with some of these symptoms. And that is one of the reasons that I do the work that I do, and why I've done it for so long, is because I think if we can crack global trade, it can actually have such a huge impact on all of these intersectional issues. So that's what I mean when I talk about the intersectionality of trade. And as we go through the presentation, I'll hopefully be able to share with you some of the impacts that fair trade has in those areas. So do you want to scroll on to the first slide for me, Kat? Thank you. Please don't feel like you have to read these slides. Some of them have quite a lot of text on, but as I said, it's mainly so that you can have these afterwards or refer back to it should you wish to. I'll just talk to the main points that I really want to make on each of them. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a background about what is fair trade, because I never want to assume that everybody turns up with the same level of knowledge about who we are and what we do. So what is fair trade? So I think the main point that I really wanted to make is really the first one I made before we started sharing, which is that we believe as an organisation, and I believe as someone who's been campaigning for trade justice for a lot longer than I've been working at the Fairtrade Foundation, that trade can really fight exploitation and deal with a lot of the different issues that we're dealing with in the world, from human rights abuses to climate change. But that can only be done if trade is managed fairly. It's done for the benefit of all, and it's done in lasting partnership. In terms of our background, so the Fairtrade label, the Fairtrade Foundation, came to be as a response to the collapse of global coffee prices back in the 1980s. So this was a call from very smallholder coffee farmers that were being paid well below the cost that it was for them to produce their coffee. And they were making calls on the northern markets to say this is not sustainable for us. And as a result of that, the conversation started between various different organisations about what kind of intervention could be created to support those farmers. And 14 years later, in 1994, we saw the first fair trade products launched on shelves, which, in case you guys didn't know, means that this year we are celebrating 30 years of fair trade labelling in the UK, and the impact that has driven for farmers and workers across the world. It's really important to us that we're about tackling the cause and not just the symptoms. So it's very easy, well, not easy, but you'll often see lots of programs and different interventions aimed at helping to deal with gender violence, or dealing with poverty, or dealing with the impacts of the climate change. But really, we want to look at what's actually driving all of those symptoms and try and tackle the root cause. And one of the big root causes is poverty, which is one of the reasons why we have taken such a firm stand on price over the years. It's one of the reasons why it's still one of the key things that we campaign on, one of the key things we ensure is central to any innovations we make in our market offer with the Fairtrade label, because we believe that poverty is one of the key drivers of many of the symptomatic things that we are seeing, and it remains to be even today, even after 30 years of doing this work. Do you want to scroll on to the next slide, Kat? So I thought I'd talk a little bit quickly about what the Fairtrade label does, for those of you that have seen it but aren't necessarily entirely sure what it means. So if you are buying a product that has the Fairtrade label on it, the way that I like to talk about this is kind of in three buckets of what it does, which is price, power, and pace. So fair trade has a minimum price. That simply means that if the market for that particular commodity, whether that's coffee, bananas, tea, if it crashes below a certain level, people that are sourcing through fair trade, businesses that are buying their products on fair trade terms, will never pay lower than that minimum price. It doesn't mean that they don't ever pay higher than that minimum price. So they're producers that are selling on fair trade terms are still able to negotiate the best price based on the quality of their product. But if the market crashes, as is the case with many boom and bust markets like coffee, then it means that they are protected by that safety net of a minimum price. We're also really interested in our model in driving power for farmers and workers in the global trading system. So the idea of bringing smallholder farmers that generally work on their own plots of land as individuals together into cooperatives of smallholder farms means that they have more bargaining power as a collective group, and they're able to share knowledge across their networks and have more influence. And that's really important, and I'll come on to talk about how important it is that farmers are able to have a say, and it's one of the key areas we're looking at as we go forward into the future. And then the other thing is pace. So we are seeing the landscape rapidly change over time. We're seeing really extreme challenges still for farmers and workers, and I'll talk a little about those in a moment. But with fair trade, as well as getting a minimum price and being able to bargain on prices for their products, every business that sources through trade also pays an extra sum of money, which is called the fair trade premium. And that money is delivered directly to farmers and workers, and it's for investment in their communities. And while maybe 10, 15 years ago, we saw those premiums largely invested in things like healthcare, maybe schools, roads, what we are now seeing is investment in adapting to climate change. So it means that they can deal with the most significant challenges to them through their own decision-making process and move at pace to tackle some of those challenges, which is also a very important part of the model. Do you want to scroll on? Thanks, Kat. So a little bit about our impact since we're celebrating 30 years. So about a third of the world's food is produced by 570 million small-scale family farms. Many of those are in some of the poorest parts of the world, and this is who Fairtrade works with. So this is the model that we set up. It obviously doesn't mean we don't take an interest in or have sympathy for what's going on in UK farming, and there are many synergies that we can talk about, and many times that we've brought farmers from some of the poorest countries together with farmers in the UK to discuss those issues, but the model that we have is specifically to support those farmers in the poorest parts of the world. And currently, as of today, we work with 1.9 million farmers and workers. That has grown consistently over the last 30 years. They are formulated into 1,800 cooperatives across 75 countries. So when I say cooperatives, that simply means, as I said, lots of individual farmers with their own hectares of land coming together into a cooperative that can then support them with finances, with sales, with networks, knowledge, training, etc. That is very much the model that we've set up, is to bring people together to have that greater bargaining power and that greater access to the things that they need to secure better terms of trade. And then within the system, we work with multiple different actors to drive change. So we work with consumers, obviously. We have a marketing team at Fairtrade that goes out to talk to consumers and drive those Fairtrade sales. We work with businesses to get them to source their commodities on Fairtrade terms, and we've been doing that for the last 30 years. We work with civil society, so when we have specific asks of policymakers or regulatory needs that we see that can improve the trading system, we speak to those policymakers privately behind the scenes, but we also use our grassroots network and supporters and campaigners like yourselves to help us to drive the message both to businesses and to policymakers about what their role is in improving lives for farmers and workers. Thank you, Kat. Oh, you're ahead of me. That's great. So I guess before I just get onto the challenges, I think what's important to note about the model that's in 1 year. I can just see that message pop up. So that was in last year, as opposed to over the length of 30 years, the figures. So yeah, before I come on to some of the big challenges still facing farmers today, I think what's important basically to say is that Fairtrade is largely known, I think, first and foremost as an intervention in the market. So it's known as a label that you'll see on food, and that is really important. And it's really important that we continue to get businesses to source on Fairtrade terms, and that certification label is sustainable, and that consumers are still buying it, and that consumers trust it, and they understand the impact and the difference that makes. But we do also want long-term change. So whilst we're working on that labelling intervention and looking at different ways in which we can innovate that, we also want to see longer-term systemic change. And that's why it's really important that we also work with decision makers like governments to influence fairer policies, regulations, finance, aid, and a better split of how trade works, so more south to south trade rather than the reliance on northern trade and northern big businesses supporting those poorer countries that we're talking about. So in terms of big challenges, there are many, and many of them are not new challenges. Some of them are newer, like the climate crisis, but some of them have been around for a very long time, and farmers and workers are still feeling them. So in terms of some of the challenges that we are set up to address, low incomes is a big one. So it might surprise you to know that many farmers still today do not even make the cost of what it is to sustainably farm their crops. So when they are selling them, they're often selling them for less than it costs them to grow them. And quite apart from the fact that that means that their farming business is unsustainable, and they find it very hard to feed their family, to pay for schooling, to pay for healthcare. It also means that when something disastrous happens, like their farm is wiped out in a flood, or another climate crisis impact hits them, they just don't have the spare money to be able to rebuild or to be able to deal with those challenges. When people are not able to have the money to send their children to school, that is when you find child labour becomes a problem, because a lot of the time they're either using their children to get more money in order to pay for food to feed their family, or they're having to take their children to work with them because they're not able to send them to school. So it is a key driver of child labour is poverty, and not having the money to be able to put your children in the place that they should be in the way that we're able to in the UK. And then not being able to feed your family obviously leads to malnutrition, and then when you don't have the income, you're not able to access the healthcare that is needed to deal with that. And all of this also results in the next generation of farmers migrating, but they don't see value, they don't want to do farming work because they don't see any value in it. And some of the most impactful stories that I've heard in my time working at Fairtrade is when you see an intervention that's happened to an older farmer, and they're able to say to you that my daughter doesn't want to go and move to a city, she now wants to stay and take over the small farm and keep that generational impact going of farming, because they see an opportunity there and they see a role for them, which unfortunately in many farming families is not the case. Gender-based discrimination is a problem in some of the key supply chains that we work in, particularly tea, but also in many of the other supply chains as well. It's the treatment of women is very difficult, and we look to try and address that and create gender committees, etc., to bring women's voices to the front and protect them in their working environments. In terms of how the trade system is set up, access to markets is very difficult for smaller countries, or for poorer countries. You look at things like Brexit, and they are not really set up to serve international development needs. They're set up to benefit the UK, and that is the decision making that drives many of our trade deals and many of our trade policies. So that makes it very hard to access those markets, and there have been many examples of that over the years. A really key one is when we used to have a cap on how much beet sugar could be purchased in the UK, and that was to enable access for cane sugar farmers that had previously been colonised by our country, and then we lifted that cap a few years ago, and that basically meant that the cane sugar farmers were shut out of the market because businesses started to buy the much cheaper British beet sugar. So that's just one example of how changing policies can really impact the access to markets for poorer farmers. The climate crisis, I can't move away from this slide without discussing the huge challenges that are involved in that. I mean, the change in weather is obviously a huge issue for people that work in agriculture. Heat, droughts, flood, not being able to know when the rains are coming, not being able to know whether their crops are going to survive, and then not being able, having to invest in higher business costs to mitigate that is very hard when you're not making enough from the crops that you're growing, and then not having the excess money to deal with any disasters that come your way. Make it very difficult, and many farmers are seeing the viability of their land go down. They're having to diversify, rely on other forms of income, You hear about coffee farmers switching to cocoa farmers switching to coffee, depending on which country they're in and what land they're working to. So it also means people are having to leave behind their core knowledge set and find new ways to survive and thrive in these really challenging environments, and they're having to do that on very low income. And then the final point to make before I move on from here is that actually, if you don't have money, it's actually a driver. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. So if you don't have the money to farm your crop in a sustainable way, then you are more likely to farm it in a way that drives environmental degradation, which then creates more climate crisis. And it's just a bit of a vicious circle. So you will see, farmers that are living in absolute poverty, cutting down, deforesting areas in order to grow more cocoa in an attempt to make more money, but then deforesting that area is driving more climate damage. So it is a vicious circle, and actually money is always the intervention that will help in some of these issues. So poverty is a big driver of the climate crisis in itself. Thanks, Kat. So what is still needed? So coming back to this framework of price, power and pace, there's a lot that Fairtrade does, and there's a lot that Fairtrade has achieved in 30 years, but it is still not enough. So we don't sell enough on Fairtrade terms. So we've talked about the impact that Fairtrade can have in terms of that extra money back to communities and that protection of that minimum price. But really, Fairtrade is a very small portion of the overall global market. We just need more people to source on Fairtrade terms, and we need more consumers to understand the impact that choosing Fairtrade over a non-labelled product or another labelled product has. And that is a constant challenge that we are always trying to think about new ways to approach and new ways to engage younger people, as often our supporter network is aging, and they have been instrumental in talking about trade and getting us to where we are. But how do we engage that younger demographic in the issues around trade and the important change that it can make? So that's the first thing, is price is still a problem. Prices need to be higher. More needs to be bought on Fairtrade terms, but there just needs to be more conversation in general in trade about prices for farmers and workers. Power is still a problem. So if you're in the Fairtrade network, you may have more power, more support, more bargaining within your cooperative. But in general, farmers and workers are not involved in the conversations that influence the decisions about their future. And that is everything from how do we tackle the climate crisis to how global trade works. They're not at the right tables. They're not involved in the conversations. They're not part of making those policies. And that is really important. How do you create an equitable world if the people that are most disadvantaged by the world currently are not at the table when those decisions are made? So they need greater control over the terms of trade, a greater say in the trade and climate decisions that affect their lives. And then pace, we're just far too slow on climate action. Our responsibilities as the UK, as is the case with many other wealthy countries, we're just not moving fast enough and making the change that we need to slow down the climate crisis and to provide the support that we need to those people that are standing at the moment on the front line of it. We need government and business action on climate change to be much faster and be much more delivery and much less talk. Do you want to scroll on, Kat? Lovely. I haven't been tracking time at all. I feel like I might end even earlier, but I'm going to get onto priorities, so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this. So with all that in mind that I've just talked to, what are the priorities after 30 years of fair trade? And we have a few, and we've been doing a lot of thinking about where fair trade needs to go next, and where we need to really place what ultimately is very finite resources. So it's not easy in the charity sector at the moment. When I first started, there was much more government funding for this kind of work. There was generally, in the UK, not a cost of living crisis. Businesses were more inclined to invest in sustainability measures. And that is still a thing that businesses are doing, but they are also having to answer very hard questions from shareholders in the current environment. And so it does impact charities like ourselves and the money and the budget that we have to work with. So we have to be really careful about how we invest that, and we have to make sure that the decisions that we make and the focus that we have is in the best interests of those people that we serve. And interestingly, before I get into this, one of the things I didn't probably mention is the way that Fairtrade is set up. So the Fairtrade Foundation in the UK is the UK arm of a federated movement, a global movement. And we don't make any decisions about our strategic priorities going forward without consultation with the producers themselves. So we have 3 producer networks. We have one in Central America, we have one in Asia, and then we have one in Africa. And they all inform the strategic choices that we make. They all vote. They have board that reports into our board. And so structurally, we are very much set up as a movement to only make decisions around the fair trade label and our priorities and our advocacy priorities and our campaigning priorities that is actually informed by the people that we are working on behalf of. So with all that in mind, we've kind of got 4 key areas that we will focus on in 2025 and probably beyond, but certainly in 2025, this is where our focus will be, and we'll review it as part of 2025's planning beyond that. The first one will probably come as no surprise. It's tackling climate change. This is, when we speak to producers, the biggest challenge that they read back to us is that they are really struggling with the climate. They're struggling with climate change being rampant and uncontrolled, and they're also challenging with being able to mitigate the impacts of that on themselves. There has been commitment to funding from the UK government. They have made commitments under the Paris Agreement to give climate funding, but as yet, not enough of it has been given. And so we have a call on the government to take action faster, to have mechanisms in place that when they do make those payments on climate finance, that they're reaching the people that need it most. And continuing to support farmers to reduce the environmental impacts of farming. So we talked a little bit about how if you're living in poverty, you are unable to sustainably farm. But one of the things that Fairtrade is able to help with is having those premiums going to farmers and workers, and access to knowledge networks and training. Is we have really great systems set up to actually support farmers to help them deal with the climate crisis and farm more sustainably. So we have, for example, a climate academy that farmers can join, and it helps them to understand what they need to do to help deal with the challenges. And we see many of them investing their premiums, for example, in climate crisis funds within their communities that they can draw on if they are experiencing damage to their land or challenges growing their crops. So that's the first one. Creating a trade policy for people and planet. So we have a new UK government, and we are going to be very heavily influencing them on what a new trade policy might look like. So trade is on their agenda. It is part of their manifesto. But we are really keen that that is done in such a way that it isn't just beneficial to the UK. And we appreciate that that is a priority for a UK government, but it also needs to consider human rights. It also needs to consider our role in the climate crisis. And it can't be developed in isolation without considering the wider environmental and developmental needs. So if we are creating development policies, international development policies, if we're thinking about environmental and climate protections, a trade policy really does need to be built with those in mind and not done in isolation. So that's the second area. Regulation. This might sound a bit dry and a bit boring, and there are certainly things that businesses can be doing and should be doing to go further, but there are also regulatory things that stop them doing that. So competition law is a big one. And at Fairtrade, we're looking at ways in which we can influence innovation in those areas. So how do we get the government to look at creating bodies and regulations that reward good business practices, and call out those that aren't going far enough? How do we get regulation so that it allows businesses to work collectively together? And I'll come on to that in the fourth column in a second. But really, regulation is a huge issue. And we need it to work for trade. There is movement in the regulatory area to do things that are intended to improve supply chains. So you will probably hear about things like human rights due diligence in supply chains. You'll hear things about deforestation. And they are really good things. So for example, deforestation is a really good example of this, in that we absolutely 100% agree that within supply chains, deforestation must stop. There can't be deforestation, and there needs to be responsibility for businesses to be looking at their supply chains and ensuring that the vast areas aren't being deforested in order to get the products that they want to sell. However, when those regulations are made and brought in, it's also really critical and important that the burden of meeting those regulations doesn't then sit on the shoulders of the people at the very bottom of those supply chains. So it's really important that they're feeding into these regulation changes, and that their funding is available, and that mechanisms are in place to support those people to deliver on them, and that businesses that are feeding in on these regulatory changes, that they are supporting the people in their supply chains to comply with them. Otherwise, what will end up is amazing pieces of regulation, but the expectation that they will be driven by people that are already struggling and don't have the money to be able to meet the regulatory environment that's being created. And then on the last area is collaboration. So reforming the trade system is a huge commitment to innovation, and we're often not great at moving away from the way things have always been done, and that is really important. So we need companies to be able to work together and change entire sectors. We will always go faster together than we will separately, and things like the competition law is holding businesses back from being able to address some of these big issues. So that is not a get out for businesses. There are certainly things they can already be doing, but there are also things that the government can be doing to change competition law and change some of these regulatory environments to allow them to work together. And by doing that, that's going to drive some really important changes for producers, right? For farmers and workers. It's going to mean that they can have longer term sourcing commitments, and they can have longer term contracts. So people will often say that they don't understand what's going on with fair trade. There's lots of different labels, that it's not quite the same fair trade that started out in 1994. And there's a reason for that, right? The environment changes around us. The way that businesses work change around us, and we have to change too, if we're going to continue to have this kind of intervention method in the existing trade market. And so it's really important to us that we do that in collaboration with producers, as I said, that we consult with them on how these new interventions might work, or how any innovations in the fair trade mark might work. And one of the things they tell us is it's really hard for them when they get given a 1-year contract. They can't plan ahead. They can't plan for what they might need next year for their business, so being able to sign up to a 4-year contract selling their products is really important, and being able to have those longer term commitments from companies so that they can plan ahead with their money is a huge piece, and being able to support that with some of these regulation changes is one of the things that we're really looking into and hoping to be able to change over the coming year and years after it. Okay, I'm on to my last slide, so then we can have a discussion, and I'm really happy to take any questions. I hope this hasn't been too heavy. I'm trying to kind of focus on the main things. It's always a balance of how much to get into the detail and how much you guys might not know already. But I did want to end with a bit about what you can do. So it's very hard to get businesses or governments to do anything without the pressure, right? So most decisions that businesses make are because of consumer pressure. That is how we saw the fair trade mark grow over the years that it grew, was because consumers were demanding it. And it's the same with government. If you want government change, we can have as many backdoor conversations with the government, we can have as many meetings and attend party conferences, but the reality is most MPs care about what their constituents care about. Their constituents elect them into their seats and keep them in power, and they will do what their constituents are asking them to do. So where there is a local movement for fair trade, like a local fair trade church, like a local fair trade faith group, like a local fair trade community, that is really important and influential in explaining to your local decision maker why your community cares about fairer trade. And ultimately, it will mean that they will be the politicians that stand up and say, on behalf of my constituents, I want to talk about fair trade, and that is often how we see things like parliamentary questions on fair trade being put forward. They come by MPs on behalf of constituents that they've met with at local events or through local conversations. So Fairtrade Fortnight starts on the 9th of September. It is at a different time this year. As some of you may know, it was traditionally in February and March. We moved it this year for our 30th anniversary as part of a swathe of things we were doing in our 30th year. I don't know whether it will stay in September going forward next year, but for this year, that is when we're running it. So it's 2 weeks from the 9th of September. And if you aren't on our newsletter, I will send all this information to Kat and Tim afterwards. You can sign up to hear what's going on during Fairtrade Fortnight. But the main ask we have of our grassroots networks this year is to put on an event, do something in your local community to support fair trade and to talk to people that don't know about fair trade. That is really important. I mean, if there is an opportunity for you to engage your MP as part of that, as we have a new government and as we're trying to get to know these new MPs and influence what they care about, that's a really great opportunity, is if you can invite them to a local event or have a conversation with them. Some people don't feel comfortable with that. That's absolutely fine. But if that is something that you feel comfortable with, then by all means invite them to something that you're doing. Some people may have MPs that attend their local faith group or their local place of worship. So that is a really good opportunity to engage them as well. We have a wealth of resources that can support with this as well, like how to talk to policymakers, etc. So you won't have to do it alone. We can help you with that. We will be launching a pledge for Fairtrade Fortnight. So it basically, what we're trying to do ahead of next year and having very explicit asks of the government is we're trying to build broad support for fair trade. So we're asking MPs to pledge their support for fairer trade. And so we'll be launching an action on the first day of Fortnight that anyone can take, which is just to send a letter to your MP asking them to commit to working with their local campaigners and with the Fairtrade Foundation to make trade fair for everyone. So that is the pledge. It's a very easy action to take. You can receive an email. It'll all be set up for you to do. So that, alongside actually speaking to your MP, or even alone if you're not comfortable reaching out to your local MP, is something that you can do this Fairtrade Fortnight. So on our website, there's loads of resources, loads of ideas for different events, etc., that you can put on in your local area. And you don't have to do something new. You could just bring fair trade in as part of an existing stall or an existing coffee morning or an existing talk, sermon, etc. There's lots of ways that you can just build fair trade into existing activities that you're doing. You can commit to being a fair trade place of worship. So that is a scheme that we run. You can sign up to it and commit yourselves, and then we will add you to our mailing list and we'll reach out to you with opportunities to get involved and actions that you can take over time. And that's great because it means that we can say to people, look at the numbers of people that care about fair trade. If we can add you to those numbers, that's always really helpful. And then it's just spread the word. So ask more people to choose fair trade, tell more people about what you've heard tonight, tell more people about why fair trade is important to you. We can't amplify these messages enough, and the more people that hear about it, the more people that go into a store and make that active choice to choose fair trade, the more impact and change we can drive producers and workers into the future.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. Absolutely fascinating. So much information. And I personally have got about 20 questions, but I'm going to open it to up to other people. I can see a couple of questions in the chat already. And maybe we could just start with those. One was about trade policy from Claire. Claire, do you want to say it, or shall I read it out?
You can read it out. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So you talked about creating a trade policy for people and planet. Who decides UK trade policy? It's more than government policy, presumably. Are the international agreements? How do we actually get into this discussion of trade policy or understand it?
I mean, it's a very good question, Claire, and I'm not a policy expert, so I can't give you all of the detail, but it is the government that makes the decision. They will consult with a variety of different bodies, etc., to reach that decision, and we would like to be one of those. So that is really the main point, is like that decision is made by the government. It's made by FCDO office. So we are looking at the right MPs in the new government to talk to about a trade policy and an overarching trade strategy. So that point I was making about a strategic approach to trade that includes an import and export strategy, but also looks at any international development policies that we might have and any climate policies. We want to talk to all the different MPs that are going to be involved in that, help them to see that bigger picture. And we would like to be in those conversations. So they will talk, and they will be lobbied by businesses as well for a trade strategy, right? So they will be lobbied by what businesses want to see happen on trade. They will be answering to the Treasury, etc. So there are lots of people that inform a trade policy, but ultimately it's the decision of the government to write a strategy and stick to it.
And do you think this government's, well, I don't know, in the run-up to the general election, they were going on and on about growth, and they have a big focus on growing the economy. Is that likely to be at odds or in conflict with fair trade policy?
I mean, look, I'm not going to lie to you. This government has a lot of challenges. And I think the last government and this government have a very explicit UK focus right now. But I personally believe they can do both. And they will have a need to answer some of these big questions, right? They will need to develop a trade strategy. They will need to answer questions on climate. They're not going to be able to ignore them. So we just need to try and influence them in the best way that we can. But, you know, I would be lying if I said that we're not up against some very tough UK-focused priorities for this government.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question from Sheila Robinson. With Tradecraft no longer operating as it was, can anyone offer advice as to where to order tea, coffee, gifts, and so forth?
Yes, I can. There's actually a page on our website that links you to different wholesalers, so I can send that to Tim after the meeting, and they'll be able to share that with you. So there are other places. Tradecraft was a huge loss to the market. There's no doubt about it. And I know that particularly churches will have really felt that, because I know a lot of church stalls sourced from Tradecraft, and it was a real shocking thing that happened. But you can still buy wholesale from other places. I'll send you a list. You can also obviously buy Fairtrade depending on how much you need for a stall or whatever it is that you're doing. You can buy it in a range of supermarkets as well. So it sort of depends on how much you need to source at any one time. And then the other thing that's useful to know is that Tradecraft had two arms. So Tradecraft used to have a campaigning organisation. It used to do campaigning, and it used to do sales as well. And then they split in half. So there's an organisation called Transform Trade that some of you may have heard about. And then there was Tradecraft PLC. So they were still linked, but two separate organisations. And then Tradecraft PLC unfortunately went into administration, but Transform Trade still exists, and that is the campaigning arm. And they bought the Tradecraft brand. So they bought it when they went into administration and sort of kept it under their ownership to do something with it in the future. And what has happened recently is they've worked with an organisation called True Origin, who used to be called Just Trading Scotland. So they've been a long-term fair trade organisation, and they've worked with them to launch Tradecraft tea back to the market again. So you can buy Tradecraft tea as of just a few months ago, and hopefully we'll start to see more of that happening as well. So fingers crossed we see more Tradecraft branded stuff come back to the market, but I can show you the details of that and other places that you can buy fair trade in the meantime.
Could you just say a little bit about the market? You showed a couple of figures. One was £28 million for consumers and 190 million businesses. What are those figures, like retail sales? Is the 28 million retail sales of businesses something else? I didn't quite understand what those figures were.
So sorry, I should have said they were annual figures. So 28 million sold on fair trade terms, £28 million of fair trade sales last year, and that meant 190 million in fair trade premium going back to farmers and workers. So that's like the extra money that goes back into communities. And then the numbers of fair trade groups is a mixture. So that's the total numbers across fair trade community groups, fair trade schools, fair trade places of worship, fair trade universities. So that's the collection of our grassroots network. And then the numbers for lobbying MPs is basically across some of our campaigns in the last sort of 5 years, we've seen 100% of MPs currently sitting in Parliament, so sitting MPs, being reached out to by a local fair trade network to ask them to take action on fairer trade.
So to go back to the original figure, is that £28 million? That's all the coffee and tea and sugar and fair trade, this, that, and the other. Is just 28 million. And has that gone down in recent years? Because it seems to me to be quite a low figure.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, fair trade is quite a small portion of the market. It's not a massive portion when you compare it to global trade, where we are relatively quite small, even after 30 years. So really the impact we have is quite incredible considering, but we do need more sales. That's the reality.
And is that partly linked to the proliferation of labels? I can remember Kit Kat bars or Nescafe products having fair trade on them for a while. Was that one of the problems, that they all became a bit blurred in people's minds?
I mean, it's certainly a problem, yes. So we are very much the victims of our own success. We launched a label. When we launched it, there wasn't any other kind of like ethical labels dealing with pay and trade in the way that we were. And we sort of taught the industry how to do it. And of course, what happens with that is then you get other organisations popping up that do the same thing. And then, 30 years later, you also have organisations saying, why are we paying a third party to do this when we could do it ourselves? That is how capitalism and the market works, unfortunately. I mean, what I would say on that is that it is for consumers to decide how much they believe the claims on different packs. I mean, particularly, I would say anything that has a third-party certification rather than own label certification, right? So anything where it's a third party, whether that's Fairtrade or Rainforest Alliance, it's going to be third-party audited, so they're not marking their own homework. And then in terms of Rainforest Alliance, which is probably the biggest label that you'll see, as well as the Fairtrade label, is we just do very different things. So their focus is very much on protecting rainforests, on environmental stuff, and then Fairtrade's model is much more focused on price to consumers. But there are lots of labels, that is true, and that does impact how many people are going to go with any one label. That is unfortunately a reality that we are dealing with.
Kathy Grant's hand, I can see.
Hello. I'm afraid I haven't seen so much of the Fairtrade logo recently. Our church used to do a Fairtrade stall, but that was a few years ago, and basically it collapsed. There weren't people wanting to do it, and the products were too expensive, or people didn't want to buy them. I haven't seen much of the actual Fairtrade logo at all much, I think, recently. So, so I'm wondering whether it's still widely available and whether it's affordable, because, of course, the cost of living crisis, which they talk about all the time, that people are just going for the most affordable products. And is this actually just about food too, or is it also about fairer prices for clothing, for instance, where I've heard about all sorts of problems?
Yeah. If I take the first one about, actually I can probably answer them both together. So it's not just about food. Food is where we started. So agricultural, our first products were tea, coffee, and chocolate. But we do also certify a range of other things, everything from footballs to cotton to gold is another Fairtrade product that we work in. So it isn't just about food. In terms of availability and price, it is widely available. One of the things I would say that I think confuses people is that Fairtrade has multiple iterations of its mark now. So way back in sort of 1994, there was one Fairtrade mark, which is the one that is most well known. It's sat on the front of packs. As time has gone on, there are different types of partnerships with Fairtrade, and there are also businesses that say, my brand doesn't want it on the front, I want it on the back of the pack, or, so over time we've had to become a bit flexible in where Fairtrade shows up on the pack, but that doesn't mean it's not Fairtrade certified. So actually it has grown over time. You can get it at a range of different price points. So there are lots of retailer own branded stuff that is Fairtrade. So if you take, for example, someone like the Co-op, every bit of chocolate in the Co-op is Fairtrade. That is everything from their bakery section to their own brand chocolate bars to small pieces of chocolate that you might find in a chili sauce. They source all of their chocolate on Fairtrade terms. You can get quite a lot of Fairtrade in Lidl, in Aldi. So if you shop in the discount supermarkets as opposed to Sainsbury's or, one of the bigger supermarkets, you can buy fair trade in there. So it is widely available. If you go to our website, if there's any particular thing you're looking for, like coffee, chocolate, or whatever, our website lists all the different retailers that you can buy it from. So I can send a link to where you can find that information as well to Tim afterwards. So, but it is widely available. It might be that it doesn't look like it looked 10 years ago, so you might not see the label sitting right bottom left front of pack. It might be on the back, for example. But yes, you can still buy it, and you can still buy it at different price points.
Thank you. Judith Rosenberger has a question. Judith.
I've got several things. One, to go back to what you were saying about the 28 million, are you sure it's not 28 billion? Because I can't quite see how they could produce 100 and something million pounds premium, but only 28 million.
Yeah, let me
sales.
check. I will check it. I've taken this from let me check the figures for you, Judith. I promise I will, and I will communicate the exact figures.
In terms of buying fair trade stuff, Oxfam sells quite a bit, and that's good because then you're supporting Oxfam as well as fair trade. You can also get fair trade communion wine given all from churches. There's a brand called Porterian, which does a fair trade communion wine. But what I was really going to ask was, you were saying at the beginning that in terms of sugar sales, the people producing cane sugar have lost out because there's no longer a cap on how much beet sugar is sold. Is that something to campaign on, to ask the government to change?
Yeah, we campaigned on it at the time. So this was probably about, I want to say 5 years ago now. We did run a big campaign at the time. Unfortunately, it didn't have the impact that we wanted it to. So we have focused on retaining those sugar buyers that still buy fair trade. So retaining those people and saying, like, it's really important that you continue to buy from cane sugar suppliers and you keep sourcing from there and you don't switch to beet. So that was kind of the tactic we took in the end, because we weren't unfortunately able to influence the decision from the EU. And that was back when we were part of the EU. It was before we left. But yeah, we did run a campaign at the time.
Because I'm reluctant to buy beet sugar because it often involves a lot of pesticides and herbicides in its production, which anyway, so that's just my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from Jeremy Tier. If you'd like to come in on that, Jeremy.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks very much for your presentation, Sarah. I've got a couple of questions from the Fairtrade Church / place of worship angle. We've been a Fairtrade Church / place of worship for a while. I've noticed that since becoming a Fairtrade place of worship, that if I've got this correct, the resources that were previously available for Fairtrade Fortnight for churches, things like material for sermons, doesn't appear to be any longer there. I can't see it for this September's material. Do you have any plans to continue doing that? Because I found that really helpful when preaching around fair trade. And the second question is around the criteria for fair trade places of worship. If I remember correctly, when I was signing up this year, on one part of the information on the website, it talked about something like will try to or will usually provide tea, coffee and sugar. And then on another bit, it was saying definitely will be providing. Which is the right one?
Okay. It should be the latter one. I will check why it says two different things. I imagine probably what's happened is when Tradecraft closed their doors, we softened it a little bit to be like, in acceptance of the fact that people were going to be probably in a little bit of confusion about how they would now get hold of that, if that's how they've been sourcing it, etc. So let me check that, Jeremy. I will check that. But yeah, the main ask we have of places of worship, like the minimum commitment as places of worship, we'd obviously love people to do more if they can, is to source fair trade tea, coffee and sugar in their church, in their place of worship. And that's kind of the minimum that we ask for as a fair trade commitment. But let me check the website and why that's looking different. On resources, yes, it's true. the reality is it's just very hard to produce. We're on very, very small budgets. I know it can seem like when we work with big businesses that we have a lot of money. It's actually very, very much not true. So the license fee that businesses pay, a large portion of that goes back out to the producer networks. And then the rest of it is used to provide them with the value for the license. So provide them with value for paying the license fee. So in terms of money we actually have to produce, campaigning resources is actually quite small. And we used to get quite a lot of funding from the Department for International Development when they existed, but now we don't. So this is not really a poor us moment, but it's more that means we've had to make some really difficult decisions on resources and try to produce ones that stretch over multiple audiences rather than having the capacity and the money to produce bespoke ones. Now, I'm really keen to investigate opportunities to work in partnership to create bespoke resources if we can. I don't know if we'll get to do it for Fairtrade Fortnight this year, if I'm honest, because it's coming up really soon. But any kind of ability for us to work in partnership with any other, Christian programs or programs of worship that would like to support on creating those resources, I would be really happy to investigate. So, yeah, but that's why you're not seeing them this year, Jeremy. And I can only say I'm really sorry about that. And I wish that we were able to provide all the different bespoke resources that people want.
Thank you.
So follow-up link to that, has Eco-Church had any impact on Fairtrade, do you think? It's one of the questions to get the awards in Eco-Church. One of the options is to follow the LOAF principles, of course, which Fairtrade is one. Have you noticed that having much of an impact or any?
I mean, it definitely has an impact in people signing up and committing so that they're part of Eco-Churches. We don't work directly with them at the moment, and that again is a resource thing. So, obviously if we want to invest in a partnership with Eco-Churches, obviously we need the staff to do it and we need the time and the money, etc. So again, like I said, I would really like to do more of these partnerships. It is on my agenda, and I'm starting to do some big looking at across the schemes. What's bringing value to the people that sit in them, what's not, what do they need more of, how can we reprioritise? It's a constant battleground on which I fight as a head of campaigns, I promise you, trying to meet the needs of everybody with the capacity and funds that we have, but I am always looking at new ways to deliver for everybody. So
I can't see any hands up. I can go back to the meeting chat. There are one or two questions we haven't tackled yet. One of which is an interesting one, which is to do with language. How does an organisation cope with so many diverse languages, with so many farmers in different countries?
It's a great question. Well, I don't talk all those languages. That's the first thing I would say. So, but that's why we have the producer networks, right? So that's why it's really important. So as I said, whether we're campaigning for change or whether we're implementing changes to fair trade minimum price standards, lobbying on regulation, etc., we consult with the producer networks to do that. And we have, in the countries, we have offices. So in the UK, we have the Fairtrade Foundation. In Fairtrade, in India, we have the NAP, which is basically they don't speak on behalf of, but they are the link to all the different countries within that area of the world. And then we have Fairtrade Africa in Nairobi, and they are the link with African producers. And then we have the CLAC in Ecuador, and they are the link to the Latin American countries. So that is how we consult. And then the way in which we engage the producers on different topics, it depends on what it is that we need answers to, basically. So there are lots of innovative ways in which we can get information out of the producer networks. Sometimes it's literally going over and running mass consultations in collaboration with those producer network offices. Sometimes it's something much more innovative, like we have a piece of software called Fair Voice, which is something where we can put out surveys to producers and they can answer them on mobile phones and send the information back to us, and that informs what we do next. So that's how we deal with it, basically, is we have, for want of a better phrase, people on the ground that are able to connect us with people, and make sure that we're hearing back from them about anything that we do.
You mentioned earlier about your supporter network aging, and as you'll see from the profile of people on this call, Most of us of a certain age. We would love to have loads and loads of 20-somethings on the call. There may be one or two I'm not looking at, but could you say a bit about the issues with Fairtrade? Because we always talk about young people are kind and generous and they're well educated and so on. Why is it such a struggle from your perspective?
Also a great question, and also something I get asked a lot. How do we get young people interested? How do we get people into our, fair trade group? How do we? And the answer is, so we don't not have young people interested, right? We have a really healthy supporter network within institutions. So we have a really healthy university scheme. We have many fair trade schools signed up. It's the gap between the two. So it's when you leave those institutions, basically until you have loads of time and you retire, right? So that's the reality. It's like those people are time poor and they have a lot of things to think about. So firstly, they have a lot of issues being thrown at them, a lot of things they're being asked to care about, which is one of those reasons that I think it's really important that if we can land anything with young people now, it's how trade can have such an intersectional impact and can deal with a lot of those issues that they're feeling pressure to care about and to take action on. So that's the first thing. But they're also just very time poor, right? So that they're starting their careers, they're maybe having a family, so it's a really hard time to get people to take action. Equally though, we also know that they care. Like, we do know that young people care. We do know that they are more ethically minded in general, not completely, clearly, as I'm sat here talking to you this evening. But in general, we know that young people are more aware of the issues, more inclined to make sustainable choices, more aware of ethics. But there is an intention action gap, right? That's what we call it, the want to do something versus the decision. And sometimes the decision not to can be informed by cost of living crisis. It can be informed by just having too much going on in your brain. There's just lots of reasons. And then the other thing is personal connection. I think that is the other challenge that we constantly face, is if you have a family member with cancer, if you know somebody who's been homeless, it's a very personal connection that you have to an issue, and it feels a lot easier to support that because you really understand it and you have a direct link to that lived experience. And I think it's always just a lot harder for people to understand the impact on people that are on the other side of the world. So it's not that they don't care, but I think that issues that are closer to home feel more resonant. And that is one of the challenges we have in international development in general, I think, is trying to build that connection between people that feel very far away and people that are in the UK. But they're just some of the reasons.
Yeah, thank you. Any final question, because we're close to the 8:15 deadline? I can't see any more hands go up.
I can see that David has a question in the chat, though, but...
Oh, is this the fair trade versus direct trade?
Indeed.
Yeah, I can answer that one quickly. So we are not in competition with direct trade, is the first thing I would say. Direct trade can be very impactful. The only thing I would say is you are relying on the company that is doing that direct trade telling you the truth about the trade that they are doing. So it is up to those people buying a direct trade product to feel that they are confident in that company, that they feel that the claims they're making are true. I mean, that is one of the reasons that Fairtrade is third-party audited, is that there is an audit trail that says that those businesses are doing what they say they will in order to have the Fairtrade mark on their products. And if you are buying direct trade, then you just don't have that assurance. But that doesn't mean that there isn't good trade happening in direct trade. So we're not in direct competition with it. But I would just say, as a consumer, it's very hard. You have to just trust what you're told on the front of direct trade.
When you use the term direct trade, you just mean dealing with people who are claiming to do fair trade. Is that right? Or is it something more?
So I mean businesses that say they're sourcing direct from producers without a third party intervening. So if you're sourcing on fair trade, right, you're buying via fair trade and you're having the fair trade mark, and there's a third party auditing company that's coming in and saying, yes, they're paying the premium. Yes, they're paying the minimum price. Yes, the premiums meet it actually reaching those producers, right? We have a third party company that's not attached to Fairtrade that comes in and does that auditing process. If a company is saying, we have a particular group in Costa Rica that we buy our coffee from, and we fly out there and we collect it off them, and we've given them some money to build a kitchen, and that's great, but you don't have any proof that that's really what they're doing. I'm not referring to any particular company when I say that, and I very much appreciate the certification can be expensive for small businesses, and that's often why they choose to do direct trade versus work with a certifier like us. So, you know, there are lots of reasons why people might choose to do direct trade rather than work with Fairtrade. We try to make it affordable. We try to do the license fee on a sliding scale, but ultimately some businesses choose to go it alone, and then it's just for the consumer to decide whether they feel that they can believe the claims that business is making. I hope that makes sense.
That's very good. Thank you very much. Judith Allenson, if you make it as quick as you could, please. Thank you very much, Judith.
Right, we used to get a lot of stuff from the co-op, and there's far less co-op material available now. I used to campaign and try and do things, and then I just gave up because our co-op said, "Oh, we can't do anything. It comes from Bradford or somewhere central." That's one thing. Would we better just donating money to you to do work and then not hassle with their trade? Those are two questions.
So, did you say you used to get materials from the co-op?
They've got far less. They've got far less stuff now. I went round last year looking for deals. So it's just chocolate, and I don't want it.
Yeah. So the co-op still sell a lot of fair trade. It might be they used to have something called a fair trade. They used to have something called a co-op pioneer scheme, which I know that they're reviewing at the moment. But that they basically probably produced like materials around Fairtrade Fortnight on behalf of the co-op, and that is under review at the moment, so that might be why you're seeing less material produced directly by the co-op. We are about to launch, so you can order Fairtrade Foundation materials for Fairtrade Fortnight at the moment. I'll send the link to Tim after this if you want to order any. So we have print materials available for Fairtrade Fortnight that you can order at the moment. So that's the first one. What was the second question? Sorry, Judith. The co-op.
If I've got so much time, should I donate £30 to you rather than?
Oh, well, not me personally, but we do take donations at the foundation for sure. To help fund our campaigning work. Yes.
Does that do more good than
I can send a donation
and just try and buy things that rot my teeth?
But I would say, like, as much as I would love people to fund us and donors, like, you know, we need to create a proper strategy to get donors in. So if it's a choice between sending £30 to the foundation and buying Fairtrade, I would buy Fairtrade because that money goes directly to the producers. So
there's your answer, and we must end it there. Thank you very much.